Hey, if you've landed here, at whatever hour, for whatever reason, I'm glad you did. Maybe you're resting. Maybe you're working, walking, cooking, or just letting your mind drift for a while. Either way, welcome. This isn't a place for headlines or drama. This is where stories breathe, where we slow down. And remember the people history usually forgets. If this story makes you smile, or think, or just helps pass the time in a softer way, feel free to like, subscribe, or leave a comment. Not because you're supposed to, just if it feels right. Now let's begin. Not with royalty or riches, but with a wedding invitation no one ever sent. And yet, somehow, everyone showed up. The villagers didn't receive invitations. They received rumors. It started as a whisper in the bakery. Old Martha, bent like a half-melted candlestick, leaned over a tray of yesterday's bread and muttered, "Did you hear? Edith's boy is marrying that girl with the lazy eye and the strong elbows. Saturday. Or maybe Friday. Depends on the moon." And like mold on soft cheese, the rumor grew. Quietly, invisibly, until everyone who needed to know knew. And everyone who didn't need to know knew anyway. In the medieval countryside, a wedding wasn't a private affair. It was a public event powered by boredom and cabbage ale. If you lived nearby, still breathed regularly, and could walk without assistance, you were invited. If you were lucky, you'd even get to sit. That particular week, the sun had been arguing with the clouds again. Rain one hour, dust the next. The ground in the village square was a soup of mud and chicken prints. But when word spread that a wedding was on the horizon, possibly in 2 days, possibly in 3, something in the village shifted. Not because anyone loved love, but because weddings meant free food. And in a world where half your meals were guesswork and the other half were turnips, that meant something. There was one person who never missed a wedding. Her name was Agnes, though no one called her that anymore. She was simply Granny Grub, named for her uncanny ability to show up wherever food was being prepared. Short, wide, with a cloak that had seen at least 5 centuries and 2 wars, she walked like a burlap bag filled with secrets. She didn't care much for romance, but she loved stew, especially stew she didn't have to make. Granny Grub heard the news from a shepherd's boy who was trying to seduce a goose herder. The boy wasn't very good at flirting, but he mentioned the wedding, and that was enough. By sunset, Granny was in motion. She passed the news like a traveling sermon. Wedding at Edith's, or maybe the chapel, unless the bishop's still drunk. Bring your spoons and your strongest stomach. Tell your cousin, the one who only comes out during eclipses. And so the village began to hum. People cleaned their fingernails with knives. Dogs smelled excitement. Chickens fled. There was no schedule, no seating chart, no menu. But there would be noise. There would be ale. And if fate was kind, a whole roast bird. Meanwhile, Edith, mother of the groom, was in full panic. She had spent the last 2 days trying to clean the family yard, which was mostly moss, broken fence, and one particularly aggressive goat named Harold. The yard had been chosen as the wedding venue because it was closer to the latrine than the chapel. The bride, whose name was Mabel but whom everyone called that girl with the eye, was reportedly very calm. She had spent the morning picking thistles out of her best dress, a brown tunic with slightly fewer stains than usual. Her hair was braided by her sister, who was still drunk from the previous night's mushroom wine. They had no flowers, no music, no cake, but they had Mabel's smile, which appeared at odd moments and terrified pigeons. By noon the next day, people began to arrive. Some carried old stools, some carried spoons. One man brought a duck and claimed it as his +1. Children ran wild, chasing beetles and each other, shrieking in delight as they fell in the mud and rose again. Muddy little saints, blessed by chaos. The ceremony was to be held beside a tree that had once been struck by lightning and now leaned like it regretted everything. A local priest was found, half sober, entirely sunburned, and handed a cup of ale to loosen the spirit. He stood between the couple and said, "Do you want each other?" They nodded. "Right. Then let's not waste time." There was no kiss, no poetry, just two people holding hands and trying not to laugh as a pig wandered past. And when it ended, no one clapped, because no one knew if it had ended. But the stew was ready, and that was clearer than any vow. Granny Grub elbowed a boy out of the way and ladled herself the first scoop. "Needs salt," she muttered, "but free stew is free stew." Someone started banging a pot rhythmically. A girl with half a lute joined in. A toothless man whistled through his nose. And sudden, the morning of the wedding felt less like a celebration and more like a small emergency. Mabel, the bride, stood barefoot on a wooden plank in the corner of the cottage, surrounded by three dresses, if you could call them that. All were varying shades of dirt. None were white. One had a suspicious cabbage stain from 1347 that refused to die. Her little sister held one up and squinted. "This one only has mud on the back." Mabel looked down at her knees, already smeared from falling in the pig pen earlier that week. "Back it is," she sighed. Choosing a wedding dress for a peasant girl wasn't about style. It was about strategy. What can I wear that won't attract flies, offend the priest, or remind people of soup? She finally chose a brownish tunic that smelled faintly of barley and regret. Her hair was tied with a fraying ribbon, once blue, now the color of melancholy cheese. She slipped on her boots, which immediately squelched. Outside, the village had begun to gather again. Some guests had never left. Others returned after a brief nap in a haystack. Someone brought a fiddle. Someone else brought a goat on a leash that was actually just a piece of damp rope. The goat did not want to be there. The ceremony site had moved. Rain overnight had turned the original spot beside the lightning tree into a muck lake. So they picked the next driest patch of ground, just behind the chicken coop and directly beside the pig pen. It smelled like commitment and poultry. Father Aldred was already there, slumped on a wooden stool, half asleep. He'd performed 4 weddings that week, 1 funeral, and 1 accidental exorcism involving a cat and a bottle of plum wine. His eyes were half closed, and he clutched a flask with more faith than scripture. The villagers gathered loosely, like laundry thrown over a fence. There were no rows, no music, no sense of formality. A rooster crowed continuously, unsure if it was mourning or simply a moral obligation. Mabel stepped forward beside her groom, a lanky man with 2 good teeth and the posture of someone frequently kicked by cows. The priest stood, wobbled slightly, and mumbled, "Well then, you two, want to be stuck with each other?" They nodded. "Right. Say something to each other." The groom looked at Mabel. His voice cracked like a poorly baked crust. "I brought you this." He held out a small rusty knife, the kind used to peel turnips or threaten raccoons. Mabel smiled. She took it, wiped it on her sleeve, and whispered, "Very shiny." There were no rings, no vows, no kiss, just a knife passed hand to hand, and a shared glance that said, "We made it this far. Might as well keep going." A chicken ran through the crowd. A child fell into a barrel. Someone sneezed and declared it a sign from the saints. And just like that, the wedding was done. No one really noticed, because by then, the stew was boiling again, and the real ritual, the ritual of eating, was about to begin. But that is a story for next time. By the time the rusty knife had changed hands, and the priest had slumped back onto his stool with a satisfied grunt, the real anticipation began to boil, quite literally, because in a pot as big as hope and twice as loud, the wedding stew was ready. It had been bubbling since dawn, stirred with a branch, spiced with whatever someone's cousin could find in the woods. No one was entirely sure what was in it. Some said cabbage, others said destiny. A boy claimed he saw a frog leap in and never come out, but none of that mattered, because the smell, earthy, warm, slightly alarming, drifted through the muddy yard like a promise. Granny Grub, naturally, was first in line. She elbowed a teenager aside, grabbed a cracked bowl and dipped deep into the pot. "Smells like Tuesday," she said, slurping thoughtfully, "but tastes like marriage." The villagers gathered in a half-circle around the cauldron. No plates, no utensils, just fingers, crusty bread, and unmatched levels of determination. Children ran wild through the feast like gremlins fueled by fermented turnips. They screamed. They threw gobs of stew into each other's hair. One girl danced with a goat. Two boys began sword fighting with spoons. Someone gifted the bride a bouquet made entirely of root vegetables tied with a bootlace. The main attraction was a turnip still dangling dirt from its root, like it had been yanked out of the ground just to attend the ceremony. The bride was delighted. She kissed the turnip on the head. A particularly bold child, nobody knew whose, climbed onto the family dog, declared himself king of the feast, and demanded tribute. Another group of kids began flinging live chickens like confetti. The chickens were unimpressed. One landed in a bowl and immediately tried to swim. Somewhere near the fire pit, an old man had started whistling through a bent pipe. A neighbor joined in, banging two ladles together like cymbals. A woman with one eyebrow and the lungs of a town crier pulled out a wooden flute and promptly played 3 notes. All wrong, all loud. It was music. Of a kind. The kind that only makes sense when you're half drunk, knee-deep in mud, and wearing someone else's socks. The sun, unable to bear witness any longer, began to lower itself behind the crooked rooftops. Shadows stretched. The pigs grew restless. The stew pot was nearly empty, but the spirit of the thing, that wild, joyful, unsupervised magic, refused to fade. Mabel and her husband sat side by side on an overturned barrel, picking bits of hay out of each other's hair. They didn't say much, didn't need to. Around them, the chaos of love and hunger and weather-beaten humanity continued. A woman sang something resembling a lullaby, only slightly off-key. A dog howled back. Someone danced with a broom. A pair of chickens eloped. It wasn't elegant. It wasn't quiet. It wasn't even sanitary, but it was real. And for one muddy musical evening, it was enough. When the last ladle of stew had been scraped from the pot and the final gourd of ale tipped into someone's lap, the village began to soften. Laughter, once sharp and clanging like tin on stone, now melted into murmurs. The chickens, traumatized but alive, had been rounded up. Children, smeared with mud and root vegetables, were finally herded inside, where they collapsed in heaps on rush-covered floors. Even the dog-turned throne had limped away to a corner, exhausted. And through it all, Mabel and her new husband sat quietly beside the dying fire. They hadn't danced much, too tired, too shy. They'd spent most of the evening smiling politely, thanking people for rutabagas and being pulled into offbeat circle dances that left Mabel's feet sore and her husband breathless. Now, in the stillness that comes after chaos, they looked at each other, really looked. "Shall we?" she asked, almost like a secret. He didn't answer with words, just took her hand, warm and calloused and still holding a breadcrumb. They stood, nodded to no one in particular, and walked away from the last glowing embers of their wedding. They didn't have a room. They didn't have a door to close, but they had a barn. And inside the barn, behind the sacks of old oats and a wheelbarrow missing its wheel, there was a haystack, thick, tall, dry enough to be called comfortable by peasant standards. It was their escape, their honeymoon suite, their hour of quiet. Mabel laughed when they arrived, the kind of laugh that trembles between joy and disbelief. "This is the cleanest place I've been all day." He grinned, brushing loose straw aside to make a little nest. "It smells better than your uncle." "Everyone smells better than my uncle." They collapsed onto the hay, still clothed, still muddy, still grinning. The barn creaked gently around them, old wood shifting in the cool night air. A cow snored in the next stall. Somewhere nearby, an owl hooted like a drunk prophet. They didn't talk about love. They didn't recite poetry. There were no violins, just the slow, rhythmic sound of two people breathing. Together. She took off her headscarf. He kicked off one boot and couldn't find it again. They wrapped an old wool blanket around themselves, itchy but warm, and lay still. There was something sacred in that stillness. No one asked them to be beautiful. No one watched. No one judged. It was the first time all day, maybe all year, that nothing was required of them. Not work, not laughter, not survival. Only this: to be beside each other in the dark, with no duties except presence. "I used to think," Mabel said softly, "that marriage would be like a fairy tale." He turned his head toward her. "And now?" She smiled. "Now I think it's like soup. It takes whatever you've got, and it warms you if you let it." He didn't have anything clever to say, but he reached out and touched her hand again. A little gesture, as awkward and honest as a chicken with a limp. They stayed like that for nearly an hour. 1 hour that didn't belong to anyone else. In the morning, there would be turnips to plant, chickens to chase, laundry to scrub, people to feed. Life would press back in, loud and hard and hungry. But tonight, they'd carved out a little piece of the world that wasn't duty or dirt, just them. And as they finally drifted into sleep, tangled in hay and one another's elbows, Mabel whispered, "This is the richest I've ever felt." A pause. "Even with straw up my nose." Somewhere outside, a distant spoon hit the ground. A final hiccup from a neighbor. A dog barked once, then changed its mind. And in the hayloft of a barn with no door, beneath a roof that leaked and a moon that peaked, two peasants began their marriage. Not with riches, not with roses, but with rest. And for now, that was enough. Forget everything you know about parties. Forget noise, flashing lights, and someone throwing up in a potted plant. Because in ancient Athens, the true party, the one where minds danced and souls undressed, began in silence, with wine, but not the kind you're thinking of. Inside a private house, far from the bustling agora and dusty sandals of the common folk, a room flickered in lamplight. Cushions were arranged in a semicircle. The air smelled of oil, figs, warm stone, and anticipation. This wasn't a banquet. This was a symposium. And the men weren't sitting. They were reclining, on one elbow, legs stretched out, their other hand free to raise a cup or gesture wildly while quoting Homer. Each guest had his place, carefully chosen by the host, or, more precisely, the symposiarch, the master of the night, the one who decided the rules of engagement, and his first decree? Dilute the wine. Yes, in a society that gave the world Dionysus, god of madness and ecstasy, the wine was watered down. Because the goal wasn't to get drunk, it was to get just drunk enough. Enough to loosen the tongue, not lose the mind. Enough to feel the edges of the soul not fall off the map. Tonight's guests were hand-picked. A nobleman with silver in his beard and secrets in his eyes. A philosopher who hadn't bathed in 3 days. a poet who brought a new poem and an old debt, a sculptor who smelled of marble dust and regret, and of course a few beautiful boys, their youth radiant like freshly carved statues, seated close to the hetairai. Ah, the hetairai. Not wives, not concubines, but companions, educated, witty, sharp-tongued women allowed in this male domain not to serve, but to speak. They poured the wine, yes, but also recited Sappho, debated Plato, and made the men sweat with riddles sharper than any blade. One of them, Thaleia, leaned in toward the young noble beside her. "If you say something clever," she whispered, "I might pretend to laugh." The evening unfolded in waves. First came libations to the gods, wine poured on the ground with murmured prayers, to Dionysus, obviously, and to Eros, because what is philosophy without a little danger? Then came the drinking games, katabos, a test of skill where dregs of wine were flicked toward a target with flicks of the wrist and hope in the heart. Points were awarded for style, shame for spills. The poet missed twice and blamed his muse. The philosopher hit the mark but missed the point. Debate followed, not like courtroom bickering, but like fencing with metaphors. "What is love?" someone asked. "Desire for what we do not have," said the sculptor. "A sickness of the soul," replied the nobleman. "A flame that consumes," Thaleia offered, sipping without blinking. The philosopher, of course, quoted Socrates, twice. But the boy beside him, quiet until now, looked up and said, "Love is remembering the shape of someone's voice when they aren't speaking." And for a moment even the lamp flames seemed to pause. The wine flowed. The words flew. The hours bent. There were no toasts, no shouting, no clumsy groping under tables. Only minds peeling open like figs, revealing sweetness and rot. They spoke of truth, justice, death, desire. And through it all they lay on their sides, like statues caught mid-thought, sipping from cups that never emptied, because ideas, like wine, refilled themselves with each telling. Outside, the city slept, but inside, under lamplight and laurel garlands, something rare unfolded, the union of intoxication and insight. And in that sacred blur between sense and surrender, the symposium continued, not to end the night, but to remember what it means to be human, curious, chaotic, yearning, and still thirsty for more. They were called hetairai, not servants, not wives, and certainly not shy. They were women educated in music, poetry, philosophy, and the fine art of putting a man in his place with nothing but a raised eyebrow. Tonight, they were the stars of the symposium, and everyone knew it. The room glowed with oil lamp light. The air was thick with wine and anticipation. Conversations danced from logic to longing, but whenever a hetaira opened her mouth, the room tilted. Thaleia, long-limbed and sharp-tongued, plucked her lyre with one hand and skewered a general with the other. "So, you believe the soul is shaped by duty?" she asked sweetly, barely glancing his way. The general, cheeks already flushed, puffed his chest. "Of course, a man is his honor." "Fascinating," she purred, strumming a minor chord. "And yet you lost your last battle and blamed the weather." The room howled. He blinked, searching for words not soaked in humiliation. "Perhaps," Thaleia mused, "the gods punish not the dishonorable, but the dishonest." The hetairai beside her raised their cups in approval. One leaned in and whispered, "Careful, dear. He might challenge you to a duel." "With what? His excuses?" And so it went. Each woman, radiant in silk and sarcasm, moved through the room like Socratic hurricanes in perfume. They debated virtue. They laughed at politics. One rewrote a Homeric verse to include better fashion advice. The men, sprawled like decadent philosophers on their cushions, watched in awe and a little fear, because in a world where most women weren't allowed past the courtyard, here were these creatures, brilliant, biting, beautiful, holding court like queens of chaos. Then came the game. Katabos. The rules were simple. Aim, flick, splash. Each man took turns launching the last drops of wine from his cup at a target across the room, a bronze disc balanced on a tall stand. Hit the mark, and you win. The right to request a kiss. But not just any kiss. The rules were clear. One kiss on the cheek, if the lady consents, and if your aim is worth her time. The philosopher went first. He squinted, mumbled something about geometry, and promptly hit the wall. No kiss. Just a pat on the shoulder from a sympathetic hetaira who whispered, "Nice theorem." Next, the poet, a bit drunk, very dramatic, twirled his cup 3 times before releasing a perfect arc of red droplets that pinged the dish with poetic flair. The room erupted. His chosen lady smirked, rose gracefully, and kissed his cheek with the kind of poise that poets ruin ink over. Then it was the general's turn. Still wounded from Thalea's verbal dagger, he poured his pride into one final attempt. He stood, adjusted his belt, and flicked. The wine flew. It sparkled midair. It almost hit the dish. And then it landed in someone's lap. Specifically, a young noble with pristine robes who now looked like he'd been attacked by Dionysus himself. Silence. Then Thalea, bless her soul, sighed deeply and said, "Well, at least your wine has finally found purpose." The room exploded again. By now, the night was a warm blur. Men giggled like boys. Women laughed like queens. And the stars outside blinked, forgotten. The line between flirting and philosophy vanished. Because here, in the flicker of lamps and flicks of wine, ideas and affections mingled like grape and water. No one really remembered who kissed whom, but everyone remembered the moment a hetaira quoted Socrates, then winked and added, "But even he never had to deal with your ego." And for once, the philosopher had no rebuttal. The night had ripened. The wine, once crisp and biting, now lingered warm on the tongue. The air, thick with honeyed breath and sandalwood, curled gently around flickering oil lamps. And with every passing hour, the room leaned closer, not in body, but in thought. They had laughed, played, flirted. Now, they began to wonder. "What is love?" someone asked, not loudly, but enough for the warmth to still. The room fell into that strange silence only found between minds on the verge of something sacred. One man, older, eyes cloudy but sharp, cleared his throat. "Love begins with the body," he said. "A curve, a scent, the hunger behind the eyes." A younger guest snorted, "And ends with regret and a rash." Laughter flickered, brief, nervous. But across the room, Socrates, quiet until now, reclining like a philosopher bored of winning, opened his eyes and said, "You're both right, and both wrong." All eyes turned to him, because when Socrates spoke, even the wine listened. "There was a woman," he began, "many years ago, Diotima, a priestess, a teacher, a mirror too polished for lies." The hetairae leaned in. "She once told me," he continued, "that love is a ladder, and every rung, every step is a deeper vision." The room held its breath. "First, you love a body," Socrates said. "Just one. Because it is beautiful. It pulls your eyes like the moon pulls tide. But then, you see another body, equally beautiful, different but equal, and you realize beauty isn't the person, it's the shape, the pattern. So you fall in love not with the body, but with bodies, with form." The men nodded. But it doesn't end there, Socrates whispered. Next, you love the mind, the soul, the wit that catches your own, midair, the courage in a choice, the poetry in a silence. And after that, you love knowledge. You chase wisdom like it's a lover who always runs just one step ahead. And when you catch her, just barely, she vanishes, leaving only more questions. And in the end, one hetera asked softly. Socrates smiled. In the end, you love truth, not the idea of a person, but the idea itself, eternal, unshaking, divine. Silence followed, not heavy, not awkward, sacred, until someone whispered, So, you're saying love is homework? The room burst. Even Socrates laughed. But underneath the jokes, the room had changed. Because once you hear that kind of truth, you can't unhear it. The wine didn't taste quite the same. The shadows didn't fall in the same places. And suddenly, that quiet, shy boy who hadn't spoken all night looked radiant. Outside, the lamps flickered. Inside, souls did. Because love, under lamplight, is a mystery, a madness, a memory you haven't lived yet, but already ache for. And as the night slipped toward morning, the guests drank slower and listened deeper to Socrates, to each other, to something nameless and eternal. The oil lamps had burned low, the wine had turned thick in the cup, and in the quiet after Socrates' words, the room felt suspended. Some reclined in silence, still digesting the idea that love could stretch from flesh to the divine. Some scribbled notes they wouldn't remember. Others just stared into the shadows, hoping to find something of themselves there. But every symposium has a final moment, and it rarely belongs to the wisest man in the room. He stumbled up. Cleon, wide-eyed, flushed, drunk past dignity, raised his hands like an oracle. My friends, he declared, swaying with conviction, I have a revelation. A few hetairai rolled their eyes. One man reached for his cup. No one stopped him. Love, Cleon shouted, is a fraud. Now he had their attention. You speak of souls and stars, he slurred. But where was love when she left me for a potter with stronger arms? Laughter, awkward, unsure. Cleon pressed on. Justice is dead. Beauty is cruel. Philosophy is just a prettier word for being alone. Then, in an act of divine absurdity, he stumbled and fell face first into the lap of a hetaira named Lysandra. She looked down at him. He looked up, tried to speak, and promptly began to snore. The room fell still. No words. Just the soft sound of a fool asleep on the very lap he once claimed to rise above. And then, Socrates, eyes still half-lighted, exhaled through a grin. Perhaps, he said, the gods speak most clearly through silence. By morning the wine had dried, the fruit was gone. The air was cooler, not with breeze but with perspective. Guests left one by one. Some walked alone, some arm in arm. No one spoke too loudly. And when the sun bathed the marble columns of the city, the symposium of the night before became what all great nights become, a myth. They would say it was a night of love and logic, of laughter and longing, of questions that stretched far beyond their answers. But they would also say this, that the loudest man in the room taught the quietest lesson. Because wisdom isn't just knowing when to speak, it's knowing when you've had enough, of wine, of pride, of pretending to be bigger than your own brokenness. And in the end, they would remember not the speeches, not even Socrates, but the soft sound of a man asleep on someone else's kindness. And perhaps that too was a kind of truth. The sun had not yet risen over Thebes, but the walls of Nephrua's chamber were already glowing with a golden hush. There was no sound, save for the soft shuffle of linen against skin, the faint crackle of oil in a brass lamp, and the rhythmic tapping of a small ivory stick against a clay bowl filled with dark galena. She sat on a cushion of woven reed, facing her copper mirror. It was old, warped slightly by time and sun, but to her it was sacred. This was not just a morning routine. This was preparation for life and for death. Neferura was not a queen, though she had dined with them. She was not a priestess, though she whispered prayers in fluent hieroglyph. She was the wife of a high scribe, the daughter of a perfumer, the granddaughter of a woman who once painted the cheeks of a pharaoh's favorite concubine. But more than any of those titles, she was a believer. A believer that beauty was not vanity, but memory made visible. That the gods saw color, that Anubis knew eyeliner better than he knew names. She dipped the stick into the galena, crushed lead ore, gifted by the desert and ground by her own hand at dawn. It shimmered faintly in the light of the oil lamp. She mixed in a drop of castor oil to soften it, then, with a hand steady as ritual, drew a single line from the corner of her eye to the curve of her temple. It was not fashion. It was recognition. "My eyes," her grandmother once told her, "are how I'll find you in the field of reeds. Even the dead should look beautiful." Neferura had been 7. The old woman had braided her hair with crushed lotus petals and sung songs older than pyramids. Now, decades later, Neferura hummed the same tune as she applied her coal. Outside, the city stirred. Vendors were preparing figs and garlic. Priests were bathing in sacred pools. A cart squeaked over sandstone. But in here, in this hush before the day opened its golden mouth, Neferura was building armor. She anointed her neck with kaifi oil, a blend of myrrh, frankincense, cinnamon, and wine. She rubbed crushed rose petals on her wrists. She wore her wig, thick, black, made of her mother's hair braided into yak wool, like a crown of shadow. Every item on her vanity, the bronze mirror, with a handle shaped like Hathor's face. The alabaster jar carved in the image of Bastet. The perfume cone, waxy and fragrant, resting at the top of her head, ready to melt under the sun and release scent like a slow hymn to the divine. To be clean in Egypt was not just to be civilized, it was to be holy. No dirt, no disorder, no scent of decay. The gods disliked chaos. And so Neferura made herself a cosmos, one line, one drop, one golden bangle at a time. That evening, she would walk into the temple of Isis. She would not speak first. She would not bow too deeply. She would not rush, but everyone would notice. Her walk like a measured poem. Her eyes outlined like sacred script. Her presence, not loud but absolute. Men would turn and murmur, "Who is she?" And the answer would not be her name. She is seen. Because in Egypt, to be seen was survival. To be beautiful was to be remembered, and to be remembered was to be eternal. When Neferura died, as all mortals must, her chamber would be emptied, her oils sealed in jars, her coal sticks wrapped in linen. Her wig would be placed on her embalmed head. Her body would be painted anew, cheeks tinted with crushed carnelian, lips with ochre, eyes with the same galena she'd used since childhood. Not for vanity, but because when she entered the Hall of Two Truths to face judgment, she wanted Ma'at, goddess of harmony, to recognize her as someone who had kept the world in order, starting with her own body. And somewhere beyond the desert, beneath the stars that once watched her apply eyeliner by lamplight, her soul would rise, eyes outlined in black, a face the gods could never forget. The sun hadn't yet risen, but the city of Thebes was already breathing in rhythm with something ancient. From within limestone homes and quiet courtyards, the people stirred like embers waking under ash. Today was not an ordinary day. Today, Ra would cross the sky in full glory. Today, Every offering mattered. Casamento, the sandal maker's son, knelt before a clay basin of water. He wasn't a priest, not a noble, not someone whose name would be carved into any wall. But this morning, he prepared himself as if Ra might whisper his name into the sunlight. He dipped a cloth into cool water and wiped down his head, shaved smooth the night before. With hands that once stitched worn sandals, he opened a cedarwood box passed down from his mother. Inside was the wig. It smelled of thyme, beeswax, sandalwood, and a hint of dust from many silent mornings like this one. The strands were dark, tightly curled, layered with care, human hair woven with linen threads, not royal, but precious. He placed it on his head with deliberate grace. To wear a wig in ancient Egypt wasn't vanity, it was ritual, a symbol of order over chaos, a boundary between the mundane and the sacred. Casamento whispered a silent prayer as he adjusted it. Then from a small jar wrapped in linen, he lifted the perfume cone. It was pale amber, shaped like a small flame, cool to the touch. Inside, crushed lotus resin, myrrh, frankincense, a sliver of cinnamon. He balanced it gently atop the wig, right above the crown of his head. In a few hours the sun would melt it, and in that melting, he would become visible, not to the people, but to the gods. The city bloomed with ritual. Men in pleated kilts gathered at temples. Women offered garlands of papyrus and blue lotus. Children ran barefoot with baskets of date cakes. Trumpets blared. Incense spiraled into the air, and above them all the sun began to rise, slow, golden, absolute. Casamento joined the procession. With each step, he felt the perfume cone soften. A droplet trickled down the back of his neck, warm, fragrant, sacred. The scent was unlike anything else, not just pleasing, but invoking. It awakened something buried in his chest, memories of his mother's laugh, of old stories whispered beside oil lamps, of gods with animal heads, and voices like thunder wrapped in honey. As the people moved toward the great temple, every head glistened, cones melting, oils flowing. The city became a river of scent, each person offering not words, not coins, but their fragrance, a prayer without speech, a soul without noise. The sun was high now, fierce and brilliant. Casamento stood at the foot of Ra's statue, obsidian eyes staring into eternity. The oil had drenched his wig, slipped across his forehead, pooled behind his ears. He didn't wipe it. He let it flow. Because every drop said, I am here. I am clean. I remember. And maybe, just maybe, Ra did too. Not the name, not the face, but the scent. That quiet, persistent fragrance of a man who had nothing except belief. When the drums fell silent and the priests lowered their arms, the crowd exhaled. The ritual was complete. But for Casamento, something remained. The cone was gone. But the scent still clung to him, in his hair, his skin, his breath. And so did the moment. That feeling of being seen, not by the crowd, but by the eternal. In a world where words faded and names were buried, the Egyptians believed that scent could outlast memory, that a single note of myrrh or lotus, carried on the wind, could lead a soul back home. So Casamento walked back through the alleys of Thebes, beneath a sun now softening in the sky, leaving behind no words, only fragrance. And the gods, perhaps, followed. In a quiet home of Thebes, before the first sunlight touched the white walls of the city, the air was already thick with the scent of oils, frankincense, myrrh, lotus, not for a banquet, not for seduction, but for departure. The woman's name was Setet. Once she danced at festivals. Once she sold perfume by the river. Once she braided her daughter's hair before dawn, humming old hymns with her fingers. Now she lay still, wrapped in linen, surrounded not by tears but brushes, jars, and mirrors. Her family had gathered not just to say goodbye, but to prepare her soul's face. For in Egypt, death was not a disappearance. It was an arrival, and no soul should arrive at the Hall of Two Truths looking like a stranger. Her eldest daughter, already a mother herself, opened the carved cedar box Satet had kept all her life. Inside, lined in cloth and prayers, were the sacred tools, the black coal she wore on feast days, a smooth bronze mirror, a comb darkened with decades of use, and a small alabaster jar of rose oil so sweet it still smelled of weddings. They began with the hair. Carefully, reverently, they combed the braids loose, not with sadness but with pride. Every strand was smoothed, every tangle undone, as if brushing memories out into the air. Then came the coal, crushed galena mixed with fat and gum, applied not for vanity, but for protection. Sate's granddaughter, barely 13, traced her grandmother's eyes with trembling hands, darkening the lids until they shimmered with the confidence of life. She always said eyeliner keeps away both flies and evil, the girl whispered. They all smiled, and for a moment she didn't look dead. She looked ready. Next was the blush, red ochre warmed in the palm. Her cheekbones glowed like sunrise again. Then the oil, massaged into hands, neck, the soles of the feet. Even the small lines around her mouth softened, as if she were about to speak. No one cried, not because they weren't grieving, but because this was not mourning. This was dressing a soul for judgment. Because when Seti stood before Osiris, the god would not ask her to recite verses. He would look into her eyes. He would smell the lotus on her skin. He would know. They placed the items in the coffin beside her, not as keepsakes, as weapons, as memories, as proof. The coal stick, the mirror, the jar of perfume, even the small wooden palette she'd used to blend colors for the temple dancers, because maybe, in the afterlife, someone would still want her art. At the final moment, a priest leaned in and whispered, "May your beauty be your voice. May your scent be your shield. May your memory walk ahead of you and greet the gods before you arrive." And then the lid was closed. The procession to the tomb was not somber. It was golden. They walked slowly, past fields and fishermen, past young girls waving from rooftops. And the scent of Sated lingered in the breeze behind them. By the time they reached the tomb, the sun had fully risen, and perhaps, in that moment, as her body returned to the earth, her soul passed into the sky, still shimmering with oil, with color, with memory. Because in Egypt, to be beautiful was to be eternal, and Satet was both. Some civilizations bury their dead in silence. Egypt buried them in perfume and light, because the afterlife was not for the forgotten, but for those who remembered who they were. They came with scrolls and swords, with the king's blessings in one hand and hunger in the other. 3 ships, the Susan Constant, the Godspeed, and the Discovery. They glided into the muddy estuaries of what the maps called Virginia, a name whispered with ambition, carved by greed, blessed by distance. The men disembarked with coats too thick and hopes too high. They planted a cross, then a flag, then their feet into ground that would soon swallow most of them whole. They called it Jamestown, and from the very first hour the land called back, not with welcome, but with warning. The river shimmered, but its water was brackish, tinged with salt and rot. Mosquitoes rose like spirits from the swamp, feeding freely on skin untouched by armor. The air was humid, still, like breath held too long, and beneath the green canopy, shadows moved, not all of them friendly. They built shelters from desperation more than design, lean-tos of logs, mud-packed walls, roofs that leaked before it rained. The men who had dreamed of riches found themselves dreaming of bread. There was no gold in the soil, no fountains of abundance, just sickness and heat and silence. Of the 104 men who first stepped onto that shore, many would never leave. One wrote, "We dig graves faster than we plant seeds." They had imagined banquets and trade. What they got was dysentery, saltwater poisoning, and fever that burned like divine punishment. The dream of empire, it sweated through their shirts and soaked into the earth, indistinguishable from the blood of men who had never lifted a shovel before that voyage. Some tried to befriend the Powhatan, the native people who watched from the tree line with eyes that had seen centuries pass before white sails arrived. But even goodwill, when laced with entitlement, turned sour. The English asked for corn, then demanded, then took. And the land, which once yielded to hands that knew it, now refused those who spoke to it in commands and musket fire. John Smith, soldier, storyteller, survivor, took charge. "He that will not work shall not eat," he declared, a rule forged not in cruelty, but in desperation. But what can you grow in poisoned soil? What can you reap when your hands shake from fever? Even Pocahontas, the girl whose name would become myth, could not save them from the hunger that gnawed deeper than politics. The summer dragged on like a punishment. One by one, men fell into shallow graves. Some cursed, some prayed. Some stared into the trees, wondering if the devil lived there or if he had simply boarded the ship with them. Jamestown was not built with vision. It was built with mistakes. And every log of every house rested on a foundation of misjudgment. By autumn, fewer than half were left. And still, they stayed. Because empire, once promised, is hard to let go, even when the promise comes wrapped in swamp water and buzzing wings. They called it the New World. But for those first settlers, it felt more like a slow, humid death masquerading as destiny. And perhaps, the cruelest part, they had not yet seen what their survival would cost others. That would come later. Some dreams rot slowly, in silence, under the sun. Jamestown did not fall with swords, but with salt water, fever, and the arrogance of expecting the earth to yield just because you landed on it. This was not Eden. This was empire. And the land would charge interest on every inch. By the time John Smith took command, Jamestown was already bleeding from the inside. The dreams of empire had collapsed into the mud, leaving behind only shivers, swollen bellies, and silence. He wasn't a nobleman. He didn't own land. He wasn't sent by any court or bishop. He was a former mercenary, a man who had seen war, captivity, and betrayal, not in books, but in scars, and that made him dangerous, because he understood something the others didn't. Survival isn't poetic, it's practical, brutal, necessary. The gentlemen, those who had boarded the ships with powdered wigs and swords polished for parades, had long refused to lower themselves to labor. Plant potatoes? Chop firewood? That was for peasants. But now the peasants were dead. And the woods didn't care about titles, so John Smith gave them a choice. No work, no food. Not as a threat. As a fact. At first, they laughed. Then they starved. And slowly, they began to listen. He forced them, the lords and lettered, into the fields. Gave them hoes instead of quills. Turned their hands into blisters and their egos into soil. And still, it wasn't enough. The river was sick, the harvest thin, so he turned outward, toward the woods, where the real power lived. The Powhatan were not savages. They were farmers, hunters, diplomats, and they had something the English lacked: food. Smith approached not with reverence, but with caution. He knew how quickly a favor could become a trap, and yet, through gestures, gifts, and uneasy laughter, he began to trade. Corn for beads, fish for tools, stories for silence. There were moments of tension, arrows drawn in the dark, misunderstandings that could have sparked war. But for a time, there was a fragile peace. And in that space, Jamestown breathed again. Children gnawed on boiled maize instead of bark. Men returned from hunting trips with rabbits instead of excuses. The graves filled slower. But Smith was not sentimental. He knew he was not loved. He was obeyed. Barely. In private, some of the gentlemen still cursed him, called him vulgar, unrefined, tyrannical, but they chewed the food his hands had bargained for. One wrote in his journal, "The man speaks little grace and much truth. We live because he does not flatter." It wasn't power Smith wanted. It was order, survival, dignity stripped of illusion. He slept with a sword near his bed, even in peace. He never let his boots dry for too long. He expected betrayal but kept building as if tomorrow still mattered. Because somewhere deep down, beyond the soldier's bark and the leader's scowl, John Smith still believed that a colony could be more than a cemetery. And for a brief, flickering moment, it was. Some leaders are crowned in gold, others in mud, fire, and blistered hands. John Smith never asked to be king. He simply refused to let his people die with their collars clean. Her real name was Amanut. To her people, she was Matawaka, child of the forest, daughter of the Powhatan chief, one of many in a lineage that stretched longer than any English map could imagine. But history rarely bothers with real names. It prefers masks, and so the world came to know her as Pocahontas, the peacemaker, the princess, the gentle thread that tied two civilizations together. That's the story, isn't it? A young native girl sees a white man about to be executed. She runs in, throws herself across him, pleads for his life. A gesture of love, of unity, of something greater than fear. It's a beautiful story, one that sold paintings, inspired ballads, made its way into books, films, and lullabies. But like all beautiful stories written by conquerors, it leaves out everything that matters. Because here's the truth. She was a child. He was a grown man. And the rescue, if it happened at all, was likely part of a ritual, misunderstood and romanticized by someone who didn't speak the language. Years later, when tensions flared again, the English kidnapped her. Not for war, for leverage. They held her in a Christian settlement, far from her river, her songs, her skin's familiar sunlight. There they baptized her, dressed her in foreign cloth, gave her a new name, Rebecca. She was 17 when she married John Rolfe, an English tobacco planter. Did she love him? No one knows. But love was never the point. Her marriage was a message, staged piece, inked in ceremony, sold as proof that civilization was blooming in the wilderness. She bore him a son, and then they took her across the sea, to London. They paraded her through drawing rooms and cathedrals like a trophy. The tamed savage, the good native. She dined with nobles who toasted her civility and ignored her sorrow. She sat still as artists painted her, always with English eyes. She was 21 when she died, in a cold country, far from the trees she knew, far from the language that once rocked her to sleep. They buried her in Gravesend, a name too fitting, too cruel. And when news reached Virginia, they didn't send flowers. They planted more tobacco. Because Pocahontas had done her part. She had helped sell a lie that empire was kind, that colonization could be romantic, that taking was mutual when wrapped in marriage. But even lies can bleed. And in quiet corners, where wind stirs through old forests, her real name still lingers. Not Pocahontas, not Rebecca, Matawaka, daughter of the land, not a symbol, a soul. Some stories are told to comfort, others to conceal. But every once in a while a voice escapes the pages, not to whisper peace, but to remind us, even beautiful lies have funerals. It started with a leaf, a slender bitter thing, burnt at the edge and kissed by lips that craved something more than food. John Rolfe had seen it in the Caribbean, not the rough, bitter crop the local tribes used, but a sweeter strain, grown under Spanish watch. He smuggled it in, quietly, planted it in the struggling soil of Virginia, watched it stretch toward the sun like a promise. By 1614, Jamestown no longer smelled of rot. It smelled of smoke. Tobacco became gold, a green crackling currency. The same colony that had once begged the forest for roots and berries now loaded ships with fragrant brown leaves, bound for London markets and noble indulgence. The English were hooked, and Jamestown was reborn. But profit has appetite, and tobacco is greedy. It drinks the land, it devours time, and above all, it demands hands, many, many hands. At first, they tried with indentured servants, poor Englishmen desperate for passage, selling years of labor for a chance at something better. But too many died, too many fled. The colony needed bodies that wouldn't disappear when the contract ended, and so, in 1619, it happened. A ship arrived, not with silk or wine, but with 20 or so Africans, not settlers, not guests, cargo. They called them servants at first, a word soft enough to dull the sting. But the truth clanged louder than euphemisms. They were chained, branded, bought, not because they were criminals, not because they were enemies, but because their skin was black, and someone had decided that this made them property. Some of them were warriors, some farmers, mothers, sons, people with names the ocean would erase. Jamestown's tobacco fields welcomed them with silence, and so began a new economy, one built not just on leaves, but on bones. That year, Jamestown grew richer and colder. A place that once struggled to feed its own had found a way to feast by bleeding others. The same leaders who had once feared death now feared profit slipping through their fingers. So they tightened their grip. Slavery was not a storm that crashed all at once. It seeped in, like fog, like smoke. And long before it was law, it was habit, accepted, expected, inhaled. And the fields of Virginia swayed in rhythm, not to wind, but to footsteps burdened by chains. Tobacco gave Jamestown its lungs. Slavery gave it muscle, but neither gave it a soul. The year was 1619. While one ship brought chains, another brought paper. Under the sweltering sun of Jamestown, the first elected legislative assembly in the New World gathered in a modest wooden church. 22 men, white and landowning, took their seats, not on golden thrones but on crude benches. No women, no slaves, no poor. Still, it was a beginning. They called it the House of Burgesses, and it was the spark of a radical idea, that governance could come from within, that voices could shape laws, that the colony wasn't just an outpost, it was becoming something else, something American. But sparks don't only light candles, they ignite fires. Outside those walls, the soil remembered. The native Powhatan people, watching their rivers renamed, their forests carved by axes, their treaties broken by hunger and arrogance, began to fight back. It was not a war, it was many wars, clashes, raids, reprisals, blood in the grass, ash in the sky. The English responded not with reflection, but with fortresses, militias, and more ships from home. And so, the cycle hardened. Expansion meant removal. Profit meant labor. Freedom meant exclusion. For every word written in Jamestown's budding legislature, another was silenced by muskets, by branding irons, by hunger. By the time a generation passed, the experiment that began in starvation had blossomed into a colony that looked like a kingdom and bled like an empire. The tobacco trade was booming, slavery was expanding, and the House of Burgesses, still there, but now reinforcing the very hierarchies it once pretended to challenge. They wrote laws about land, but not about the people it was taken from. They debated rights, but not for the ones in chains or the women who bore their children in silence. They voted, but only when the mirror showed their own reflection. And yet, in all that noise, in all that cruelty, something else was forming. A paradox, a contradiction, a seed. Because buried within the hypocrisy of Jamestown was a question too stubborn to die. What if freedom meant everyone? Centuries later, that question would echo again. In fields, in courtrooms, in marches, in the breath of men who couldn't breathe. And it would lead people to remember this place, not for its dreams, but for its debts. Jamestown gave birth to a nation, but like many births, it came with blood, with screams, and with the forgetting of the mother's name. History rarely whispers. It leaves echoes in names we forget, in systems we inherit, in dreams built on uneven ground. Jamestown wasn't just the start of a colony. It was the blueprint of a contradiction, a place where freedom was drafted with one hand and shackles tightened with the other. And yet, by walking through its mud, its fire, its hunger, and its silence, maybe, just maybe, we begin to understand the world we live in now, not as a clean inheritance, but a complex legacy. If this story stirred something in you, a question, a memory, or even just a quiet pause, then thank you. Thank you for staying. Thank you for listening. This journey was made for people like you, the ones who stay a little longer, who seek the truth not in glory, but in the cracks beneath it. If you found meaning here, I hope you'll return. There are more stories waiting. Some will make you smile, others will make you ache, but all of them, in some way, are yours, too. So, until next time, take care of your questions. They tend to lead somewhere important. And thank you, truly, for walking this road with me.